to interview Caroline Flanagan, author of Be the First, People of Colour, Imposter Syndrome and the Struggle to Succeed in a White World. Hi, Caroline.
Hi, Jeremy. Thank you for reading out my very long subtitle. Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
You're very welcome. It is a very long subtitle. Now, first of all, what is imposter syndrome?
So imposter syndrome, for those listening that don't know it, haven't come across it, is characterized, it's a special form of self-doubt. I like to call it a unique form of self-doubt. And there are three elements to it. The first one is you feel like a fraud. And then there's that feeling that all of your success is down to luck. You struggle to internalize your past achievements. And then there's the fear, kind of a constant anxiety that any minute now, someone's going to tap you on the shoulder and expose you as the fraud that you think you are.
So why do you have imposter syndrome? I guess I know the answer because I read the book, and it's because you were the only black face in a very white school. And then you were the only black face in your class at university, at Cambridge University, and then you became a lawyer and the only black face there. So, but surely you must have realized, I'm good enough for this. Why do you have imposter syndrome?
Well, that's the thing about imposter syndrome, Jeremy. It has nothing to do with reality, to do with the actual facts. It really doesn't matter how many achievements you've got to your name, what you've done. Your internal voice is telling you all the time you don't deserve to be there. And you can imagine how, for me, there was this duality, right? So internally, I think I don't deserve this success, you know, the more I achieved. But also externally, being that one black face in what I like to describe as a sea of white faces, being the only or one of the only people of color in the room, meant that I just had to look around me, and that message was being reinforced that I didn't belong because there was no one else that looked like me or had really the same type of background that I had.
So just tell me a bit about your background, because lawyers that go to Cambridge University, you'd expect to come from a very privileged background, but your background, your dad was a bus driver and your mum was in prison.
Yeah, so not your typical background for someone who ends up certainly going to University of Cambridge and then going to work in the city in a Magic Circle law firm. Yeah, my background was very different. My parents never lived together, and yeah, we were it was much more closer to the poverty line than most of my peers when I got to the law. What can I tell you? It was an extraordinary experience for me to be 1 minute at home surrounded by people of color who looked like me, and where our concern was, you know, how we're going to pay bills, where the money for the next meal was coming from. You know, my dad, for example, who I lived with for my first 12, 13 years, he would be going off to work and leaving me and my brothers with, you know, £1 to last through the day to get us food. And to go from that to finding myself in quite a middle class environment at school was a real shock. So quite a contrast, Jeremy.
Yeah, so, and you went to this fancy school and you were the only black face there. And the one thing that horrified me was the horrible teacher that used to call you Lady of the Jungle.
Oh, so that bit in the book jumped out at you, I guess. It is pretty shocking. Yeah. It is a really...
How would he do that then? So would he literally, you know, be asking questions? Elizabeth, do you know the answer? Lucy, what about you, Lady of the Jungle?
Yeah, that is exactly how it was. And, you know, I being there, being very self-conscious, being young, I would be sat at the back. I was tended to be quite a quiet student. And that's exactly what would happen. He would call on us to answer a question. And on the rare occasions, I may have put my hand up, but most of the time I didn't. And he would single me out and actually say, what about you at the back there, Lady of the Jungle? What do you think? And that was his name for me throughout school.
God, awful man. I hated that bit. I wanted to punch him, but I imagine you're still not in touch with him anymore.
Not anymore. Although I don't think he, you know, it's interesting because it really reveals the tension between what now would be considered, and it's clearly sort of racist behavior, right? And then, like, in his mind, he wouldn't have thought he meant anything by it. And in so many other ways, he was a very, you know, a decent enough teacher and seemed a kind enough man. But that's the struggle, isn't it? That's the issue. And one I touch on in the book is those very, well, it's arguable whether that was a grey area, but those behaviors which often conflict with what you see a person to be and how that person presents normally. They might be very well educated, have, you know, liberal opinions, but then might come out with something like, with an expression like Lady of the Jungle.
So what, you now go into firms and talk to particularly black lawyers, people of color. What is this something that a lot of them have found, and how do you help them overcome it?
So when I go into law firms, let's be clear, Jeremy, and this is what I talk about in Be the First, is I am generally talking to an audience of a predominantly, overwhelmingly white audience. There has been, I've noticed in the last couple of years, increasing numbers of people of color in the room, but actually I'm still talking to an audience that is not at all diverse. And that's the point. You know, I'm going in for two reasons. First of all, I guess it's an awareness raising piece, really to help people to understand the challenges, the particular barriers that are experienced by people of color in those kinds of environments. And then also to speak to the person of color who's the lonely person in the room, who's the person, by the way, I wrote Be the First for, and really help to empower them to get a sense, have a sense of purpose about their role rather than feeling lonely and isolated, which is so often the case.
And just take me through the title, Be the First. As I understand it, it's, you don't think I shouldn't be in this room. You should think I'm the first one in this room, and you're kind of paving the way for others. Is that right?
Yeah, the idea is to move, I guess you could sum it up, Jeremy, as just a mindset shift. This is, Be the First is 400 pages of helping you make a complete mindset shift, which will completely change the way you show up. So think about it. If I'm showing up, I'm the only person of color in the room, in an organization, very competitive environment, that makes me feel small. It makes me feel powerless. I tend to, and this is the imposter syndrome coming out, the playing small, avoiding opportunities, right? Whereas if I get a sense of myself, if I identify with being, actually, I'm not the only one in the room, I'm the first one in the room, that changes everything. It changes even how I can relate to people's comments towards me, or it changes how I process people's attitudes towards me, because I see myself as having a purpose that's bigger than what's going on in that very moment, and I can get through the struggle that much more effectively and come out feeling that I have a sense of control and a sense and not having that powerlessness.
We'll talk in a moment about how you overcome imposter syndrome and what you can do about it. But what would you say is the worst example you've come across, either that's happened to you or to some of the people? Because you've chatted to a lot of people and you do case studies in the book.
Yeah. So worst example of imposter syndrome, or of sort of the racism side of imposter syndrome. I guess the worst example often just feels like the one that you've lived, and I'll speak to that because that's the one I know best. I'd say, you know, it's something that has followed me throughout my school life, throughout my career from the age of 6. But the one that stands out for me, I think, was when I wrote my first book, Baby Proof Your Career. And the reason why that was worse is because I had recently left, a few years previously, I'd left that competitive environment in the city where I was the only one in the room. And I honestly thought that I wouldn't have imposter syndrome anymore if I was no longer that one person in the room. And then when I was on the eve of publishing this first book, and I'm stood there in Waterstones, and I'm supposed to be feeling excited about it and looking at all of the other books, I realized that my imposter syndrome is so deeply ingrained. I hadn't escaped it at all just by leaving the city. It was still with me. And that was actually the pivotal moment for me, because it was such a crisis point. That's what actually triggered the solution that I talk about in Be the First, and what I want to share with people of color who are in that situation.
And for me, and we've worked together quite a lot over the last year, I remember the time, it was about 6 months ago, when you were a little bit behind with your book. And I said, how's the book going? You went, oh, I'm a bit behind with it. And I've been thinking I might not be the person to write this book. And we laughed about that for ages, because that's exactly what someone with imposter syndrome would do. And I said to you, of course you're the person, because you are the one person that should write this book. And you were still saying, I'm not sure if I'm... How do you feel now that the book the book literally comes out in 2 days' time? Do you still think, oh, I'm not the person to write this book?
No, I think I feel so strongly that I am exactly the person to write this book. That experience that I had, that sort of imposter syndrome moment about the book, was a really critical one for 2 reasons. First of all, was reminding me, I still suffer from imposter syndrome. I write about that in the book. And when I'm talking on stage, it's also how I can still connect and really relate to those who still suffer from it. So my imposter syndrome hasn't gone away. However, I have the tools to solve my imposter syndrome so that I can go on and do what it is I want to do and I'm driven to do. And that's exactly what I'm teaching in the book. So what was great about that situation, Jeremy, is that it was a perfect test drive, if you like, in real time, real life, with big high stakes. Writing this book, it was a real test drive for the Be the First and the tool that I share in it. And I felt, if anything, all the more confident about the value that it can bring people when they read the book.
Yeah, it's like the perfect philosophical argument. Because you had the doubts that you should be the person to write the book, it proved that you were the person to write it. And if you hadn't had the doubts, you might have been the person. And it's like a loop. You keep going round and round in that loop about it. So there's loads of stories in there about imposter syndrome, and then you come to what you're going to do about it, and you come up with this thing called the imposter speech. Now, just explain what that is.
Yeah, exactly. So the imposter speech is a personal identity statement. It's like this powerful statement that you say to yourself repeatedly. You can say it like I recommend, and then you can see in the book that I give details about saying it to yourself every day, really internalizing it. Or you can say it in that moment when you're about to step forward and do something out of your comfort zone, when you really need it. Now, the best way to describe it is it's a bit like an elevator pitch. You know the elevator pitch, Jeremy, where you're supposed to have this 1 minute pitch so that if you're in an elevator and your CEO or senior partner walks in, you know exactly what to say to make yourself sound really impressive and bring out your best self. It's like that, but instead of being about impressing other people or really putting on a show about who you are, it's actually a speech that's for you. It's completely personal. You don't have to share it with anyone. It's the speech that you say to yourself to get yourself to show up as your best self and most powerful self.
Yeah, I think elevator speeches are really good, and I've had one prepared for a long time, but I never seem to meet the right people in the elevators. That's the only problem with it. But sorry to do a line, but there we are.
Oh, we've lost. It looks like we may have lost Jeremy. Let me just check and see if I can bring him back. So hopefully, if some of you are listening, I can see we've got a couple of listeners there and giving some comments, which is really amazing. I'm loving this interview with Jeremy. Hopefully, I'm going to get him back sometime soon. So we were talking, while we're waiting, we were talking about the imposter speech, and that's really what this book is intended to do, what Be the First is about. It's an invitation, really, and a recommendation that if you want to solve your imposter syndrome, we need to stop trying to do that at a doing level, always trying to sort of do these different, take these different actions. Like it could be just look at your successes and tell yourself you're good enough, or fake it till you make it. I find a lot of the solutions out there which have not quite worked for me in the past, often don't work, certainly don't work for people of color who are battling a form of imposter syndrome, which has that external element of you being the only one in the room and feeling excluded. So the idea of the imposter speech for solving your imposter syndrome is that we stop the kind of doing piece and we focus on the being. Imposter syndrome is about who you think you are, who you are being in a particular moment. And the imposter speech is really it's a structured formula for creating a speech that helps you be like everything that you are, your values, your past successes, but also everything you've been in order to get where you are, your failures that you've had to overcome. And also it gets you to focus on what your purpose is and where you want to go. So it's a very structured process. So I think we've got Jeremy back. Jeremy.
Hello. I had no idea where I went.
I don't know. I thought you'd gone to get a cup of tea. I was just we do have a few watchers, so I was just telling them about the imposter speech. I'm sorry you missed it, but you have read the book. So I was just telling them about
I know all about it. I know all about it. And I know that you're not an imposter and you are the absolute person to write this book. Let's just talk about the racism bit then, which is the sort of other bit that's in the book. Is it still a big problem? I mean, I imagine it was
Mm.
20 years ago. Is it still a big problem? What sort of things do people say when you speak to them in firms?
Yeah, it really is still a big problem. I know if you're not seeing and living it yourself personally, you probably find that really surprising, but it very much exists. I was at, and one of the occasions that actually really motivated me to write this book was at a panel event. I was on a panel for the Black Solicitors Network a couple of years ago, and we were talking about being authentic at work and authenticity. And so it was a huge audience, people of color, and they were sharing their different stories of different expressions, some of them quite blatant, quite obvious, like really direct racist comments like, isn't it true? Why are all Black people like this? Or is that really come naturally to you because you're Black? Those kinds of comments. Also ranging to the outright, downright offensive if they're a person of color, of Asian descent. You know, was it curry again for dinner last night? You know, those kinds of comments, which we would hope have been left behind in the 80s, where that kind of thing was more common. It's still going on. And the problem is, it's going on in environments that are so sort of powerful and influential, where there are people in very senior positions who feel quite untouchable and feel that it's okay to just make those little jabs and make those throwaway comments, and it doesn't really matter, and you've got to just toughen up if you want to get by in the city. So it very much is still going on, and I hear evidence of it all the time, sadly.
And what would you hope that people get out of this book? You know, someone suffering from imposter syndrome, what would they get out of it, or people of color reading this book? What I always think the test of a good book is, what will they be able to do or think differently about after having it?
Yeah. So one thing, I'll start with what they won't get out of this book, Jeremy, because that will make it clear about what they will. So what they won't get is something that's going to like make them conquer their imposter syndrome and they never suffer from imposter syndrome again. What they will get is a completely different understanding of their imposter syndrome and what their imposter syndrome is there to do. I talk about how this tool, the imposter speech, is the tool you use to turn your imposter syndrome from a weakness, something you feel that makes you small, feel like the only one in the room, into a strength, which is something that makes you express, see the value in what makes you unique, and be able to show up as somebody who is able to feel confident and courageous in a moment when you need it, but also able to showcase your value. Now, the best way of just explaining that is to look at how how that imposter speech has worked for me. I have seen through repeated use of it over the last 3 or 4 years that now I'm completely leaning into challenges. If I'm going through weeks and I'm not being tested and stepping out of my comfort zone, I go out looking for them. Like, for me, it's a normal state to feel uncomfortable and to see that as appealing and attractive when that discomfort is going to lead me to closer to a goal or to fulfilling my potential. I've had a lot of comments recently, amazing support about Be the First, and about, somebody talked to me today and described my meteoric rise. I'm talking about that because that has been possible because I have the imposter speech. It's that's enabled me to have the courage and confidence to, I think, show the world how much value that I have to share with them.
Well, I think it's a great book. I just wonder if you'd share one of my favorite stories in the book. If you don't mind me saying, is that when you went clay pigeon shooting?
I can't believe that's your favorite story.
Well, it's because I like my sport. You know, I like my sport, and it's just a sport. Yeah. So it was a time when you felt completely out of your depth.
Yeah, exactly. So the clay pigeon shooting story is a great example of the kind of cultural and social barriers that really exist in leading organizations around the world, which are quite elite, which are full of just sort of mostly public school, middle class men and women who have had quite a, whether they realize it or not, quite a privileged background. So something like clay pigeon is I suppose it's the most extreme example that shows the contrast between my life, my childhood, my socioeconomic kind of background, and that of those I went to law with. So I managed to, just by chance, I was invited on a client event to go clay pigeon shooting. Client events, if you get to go on them as a junior lawyer, it's massive. That's how you can make contacts. That's how you can make an impression. So obviously it was really important that I showed up really well. I have no idea, still don't really understand what clay pigeon shooting is, but obviously I wasn't going to try and show that, right? I've got imposter syndrome. The last thing I want to do is do something that makes me feel exposed. Unfortunately, I had so little clue that was the only inevitable outcome. I showed up in jeans and trainers and just like a puffer jacket that I had at home. And everybody else was wearing these kind of barber type wax jackets and their wellies and their caps and looking very countryside. And then, of course, they start, I get handed this rifle, they start shooting at these kind of strange things going past in the sky. And there was all this kind of guffawing and shouting. And I have absolutely no clue. And I couldn't even save face, Jeremy, by at least hitting any of them. So desperately self-conscious at how utterly awful I was at this, I turned to a woman next to me who was a client. I guess I was probably hoping for some sort of, camaraderie or some support. And I said to her, "Oh, at least these are the clay pigeons. When are we going to start shooting the real ones like this?" And she looked at me, and there was utter disbelief on her face. She said, "We are clay pigeon shooting. We're not shooting real pigeons." And it was just one of those moments where all of my imposter syndrome just overwhelmed me in a moment. You want the ground to sort of just swallow you whole. You want to disappear, but you're there. You're stuck in the moment, the discomfort of it. I will never forget how humiliated I felt.
Well, it is a great story, and the book is full of great stories like that, where we're really rooting for you, like, come on, you can do this, everything's against you, yeah, you can do it. And then you've got to the top, and well done. So the book's Be the First: People of Color, Imposter Syndrome, and the Struggle to Succeed in a White World, and it's out in a couple of days' time. And you're doing a bit of a launch with a panel, aren't you? Typical Caroline, you want some other people up on the panel with you as well. Just have that, because people might want to come along to that and ask them questions. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, really exciting. It's launching on Friday, and the event, it's at 9:00. I've called it a book launch and panel event. I mean, I've squashed those all together. And I've got 3 amazing guests: Scott Morrison, Dr. Joanna Bay, and Daniel Winterfeld. And we're going to be having a panel discussion about how helpful is it to celebrate the first. So talking about visibility and role models, which are so important, right, to our success, and the fact that they're so absent for lots of people of color in big organizations. I want to get into a discussion about how helpful it is to really kind of put someone in the spotlight, like the first person of color to be a partner at a law firm, or the first person of color to have played for the England football team. How helpful is that? What impact is that having on minority communities? It's going to be a really interesting discussion. And of course, I'm going to be celebrating my book. So if nothing else, maybe you want to join me just to give me a big cheer and a big hello for that.
Thank you very much. I'll certainly come along and have a look at that. Caroline Flanagan, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's been a pleasure. Thanks a lot. I'll speak to you soon. Bye.
Bye.